Yep, testing. Katie, yep, okay. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to a very hot COP30. First up, I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists, Ethan Soloviev from How Good. He's the Chief Innovation Officer for How Good and has been working with WWF on some of the things that we're talking about today. And Emily Moberg, Senior Director at WWF Markets Institute, who is responsible for a lot of the science behind what we're talking about today. So welcome, thank you.
Thanks for being here.
And today I'd like to start with a number, which is 3 billion tons, which is projected cereals harvest for 2025, which is going to be the largest in human history. And I wanted to mention that because often agriculture gets a bad rap, but the reality is that the food system has managed to feed a population which has grown from 2.5 billion in the 1950s to 8 billion today, which is an astonishing achievement. And I think we need to recognize that success. The problem, of course, is that it has come at the expense of enormous environmental problems, and that's what we're going to be talking about today for two initiatives from the WWF Markets Institute, Codex Planetarius and the 1% Fund. Next slide. The clicker isn't working. So the big question that which we're asking is how do we minimize the harm to the natural resource base while maximizing production? And there's a load of numbers up here which will be relatively familiar to anyone who works in agriculture. And agriculture is responsible for an enormous amount of environmental damage. 78% of water pollution, 3/4 of deforestation, 50% of topsoil loss, 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. But all of these are important numbers, but the real problem is the fact that they are leading directly to a serious productivity problem. Total factor productivity, growth, so the growth in productivity from the agricultural sector has declined by 68% in the last decade. And that's a problem because although productivity is still growing, it's not growing nearly fast enough at the 2% that is needed to feed the world by 2050. So one of the things that we are doing at the Markets Institute is connecting these environmental impacts to productivity, which is critical for incomes, for food security, and to feed all those people in the future. So how do we look at this? Well, the only way that you're going to fix a huge problem like this, and there is never enough money to fix any of this, is to look at things a bit differently. And Emily's going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, the science behind this. But the key to what we're talking about is that a huge portion of environmental impacts is concentrated in a very small number of producers. It's sort of the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle for agriculture. And you see this in other supply chains, other industries. It applies to agriculture too. Not always, but often. And what we have a lot of evidence of is that 20% of farms create between 60 and 80% of environmental impacts, but only produce 5 or 10% of the actual volume of production. And that's important because if you can find them, and it's a big if, and if you can help them, which is a big if, it's a very, very efficient way of not impacting productivity and production whilst really mitigating some of the environmental harms which is causing a wider productivity problem. So that's how we're looking at this. And the important thing to note here is that we're looking at this in terms of regulation, not in terms of voluntary standards. And the reason for that is voluntary standards are great at helping the best. So if you pass Rainforest Alliance certification or fair trade or whatever, organic, then you get market access, you get a premium, whatever it might be. The issue there is that there's a ceiling to that. The most certified product in the world is coffee, and that is just about 30% of total production. So you're missing 70% of farms. You talk about ingredients like soy, it's more like 2 or 3%. So what we're looking to do is, instead of focusing on the best, counterintuitively perhaps, we're looking at how do you raise the floor and focus on the worst as a way of increasing productivity, reducing environmental emissions efficiently. And all of this is based on a few common structural problems which we see in the food system. The first is that a lot of focus when we talk about agriculture is on practices, the difference rather than performance. So the difference between low-till agriculture versus soil health. I mean, low-till can work as a way of improving soil health, but the problem with this is low-till isn't always the best option. Whereas if you measure soil health and you have a soil health target, you can apply it and scale it, and we're all about scale. The second is data doesn't exist, or at least it doesn't exist in a way that is consistent, accurate, scalable, usable, especially at a farm level, and especially if we're talking about the same worst producers in terms of low efficiency marginal farms. So that's a huge problem, and one of the ways we're dealing with that is technology. We'll talk about that in a minute. The third is trade is now a huge part of all of this. It's risen from 10 to 30% of production over the last 4 or 5 decades and is growing. And lastly, you can't help any of this without money. And there is, depending on who you read, about $1 trillion a year finance gap when it comes to ag. So Codex Planetarius is based on something that works, which is Codex Alimentarius, which is the global system of food safety, which works, which is why we've used it to an extent as a model. And it's been signed by 188 countries and works well. So what we're trying to do is use the same sort of approach, but apply it to environmental aspects of agricultural production and productivity. So this pretty much applies all of the principles I was talking about. We're looking at moving the floor, not the ceiling, targeting the worst farmers, not the best, driving efficiency of mitigation so that we don't need to spend so much money. It doesn't exist. It's all around very, very simple, very light touch, very minimum standards. So this is, again, the floor. This isn't trying to raise the bar in terms of the best producers. This is really just trying to say, at a very basic level, how do we mitigate global problems? Minimize cost, maximize efficiency. And all of this is basically based on we need to improve our short-term efficiency and our long-term resilience. Otherwise, we're going to have a real food problem going forward. And how we're doing this is all backed by the Moore Foundation. We're working with the World Bank, FAO, GEF, and we've run 8 pilot projects in 8 countries with 8 commodities to look at how this would work in practice, what data is available, and where the gaps are, what the problems are. Would this impact trade in any meaningful way? And in general, not really, and certainly not materially. And because we're looking at the floor, this is quite an effective way of trying to get to our productivity and environmental objectives very simply, very cost effectively. We're also looking at how you can simplify all of this with technology. It's very difficult, it's very expensive to get farm-level data on a lot of these environmental standards and metrics. So we've been working with people like Hestia at Oxford University who are looking at farm-level variability, people like Epoch and Trace who've got technology who are linking environmental impacts to trade to see if we can shortcut the process. And part of that is doing things like looking at supply sheds in a more sophisticated way. This is an example from our pilot in Indonesia, which is looking at using AI and intelligent first-mile data systems to define supply sheds much more accurately than the sort of standard, let's draw a 50-kilometer circle around a supply point or aggregation point. And what it's demonstrated is about 5% of supply sheds, aggregation facilities, create about 83% of deforestation risk. So just focusing on 5% gets you 3/4 of the way there. Again, it's all about efficiency of mitigation. And I'm almost done, so I'll be handing over soon. Everyone will be relieved to hear. If Codex is about setting standards, then the 1% is about how to finance mitigation. So if somebody can't meet the standards as a marginal producer, you need money to fix that problem. Otherwise, this doesn't work. And one of the things we're looking at is a 1% levy on very specific exports. So, but as a way of effectively providing a risk pool, a bit like the oil industry or the mining industry does, to mitigate industry environmental damages. So the idea is, if you took a 1% levy on 3 or 4 of the top exports from Brazil, that raises about $750 million a year. How you use it then is to draw a line under a lot of these environmental risks, which are actually end up being a compliance risk further up the supply chain and become a productivity risk and a security supply risk lower down the supply chain. So the idea is, and we're working with a number of different governments, private sector actors, have spent an awful lot of time talking to people to understand, because there's always going to be a finance gap, how can you raise money in a way that doesn't materially impact trade and doesn't create additional cost for producers. So we don't know if that 1% is 0.5%, 0.3%, 3%, but the key thing is to take a relatively small fee and use that to underwrite compliance risk. Yeah, and I've already covered this, so I think the key thing here is that, again, this is a flip side of Codex. If you can identify these worst producers, you need a way to fund, which is paid for by the trade part of the equation, which is effectively internalizes environmental impacts. At which point I would like to hand over to Emily Moberg, who will explain much better than I ever could the science behind this.
Great. Can you hear me? Fantastic. Okay. Thank you so much. If we can have the next slide. I'm going to deep dive us a little bit into the climate component of this Codex Planetarius process. Do want to highlight that when we're talking about these impacts, climate is not the only impact we are talking about, but given that we are here at COP30, that is what I am going to talk about, and that has been my focus as part of the Codex Planetarius. So, as Chris highlighted for you before, we know that the food system as a whole is responsible from cradle to grave for about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And we also know from very sophisticated modeling work that the food system is capable of preventing us from reaching a 1.5C future if it alone remains not acting. This graph here really just shows us some snapshots in time. So looking at this 2020, which is roughly what we also have currently with respect to emissions, not a dramatic change. And then 2030 and 2050 with respect to what are the emissions rates that are consistent with a 2-degree and a 1.5-degree future. The takeaway here is that we need about an 80% absolute reduction from the food system in 2050. And that's while we produce more food for an increasingly growing and affluent human population. And we need very significant progress towards that goal by 2030. But when we talk about those big global average goals and what the impact of the food system is on average, that really masks a lot of this variability that both underlies the food system and what really drives why something like Codex Planetarius would work. So these two plates represent data from real farms, and I did not cherry pick the absolute highest and absolute lowest, they're close, of what the emissions for these two meals could be. So in excess of 170 kilograms CO2 equivalent, or just above 10. Those producers exist right now. And so the challenge, as Chris has highlighted for us, is how do we identify the folks who are producing that plate with those high emissions so that we can let the folks who are already doing this great work continue doing that. So when we're analyzing what Codex would look like for a particular impact, we are really going through what is the evidence that we have for the metrics in these impacts, in this case for climate, and trying to understand to the best of our knowledge how that distribution across farms, across commodities looks like. So this graph here is showing some results from our climate work. On this horizontal axis, I'm showing the proportion of emissions that we could reduce just from internationally traded foods at different levels of a threshold for greenhouse gas emissions. So that threshold starts very low up at the top and increases. And what we're showing here on the vertical axis is the amount of production that we're implicating. So the idea here is if we set the floor very, very low, there's a lot of food that is implicated. And if we start saying, okay, a little bit more emissions are okay, we're shifting both how many emissions we are reducing, but also how much of the food system is implicated. And what we can see here, and I've colored these just so you can distinguish some of these thresholds, is that we actually can get to a really pretty substantial difference where we're seeing 15% of emissions from the food system reduce at less than 2% of the total volume. And we actually can fine-tune this much more if we start to set some of those thresholds differentially between, in particular, animal and vegetal products. We can get that higher emissions reductions at lower amount of productivity affected. This here is just showing a little bit with respect to Chris's point about how do we start to identify these farms and how do we think about what this really means for different production. These are different processes that we'll often hear about in the food and ag space: enteric fermentation, manure management, aquaculture, vegetal effluents, land use change, drained organic soils, soil carbon management, how variable those emissions are per kilogram of product, and then also what the total emissions are over time. This is available in the report on the Codex Planetarius website. And the takeaway here is that for each of these processes that are going to add up to that total footprint for an individual food, we're often seeing 10 to 100 times variability, which offers us, in many cases, the ability to start thinking through, well, could we use remote sensing? Could we use other data sets to identify where those outlier processes are occurring to help us hone in on particular farms and particular regions where these hotspots are occurring? So, turn it back over to you, Chris.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emily. So I'd like to now hand over to Ethan, who has been working with us on some of the Codex variability work using HowGood's system, and who would explain it much better than I can.
Great, thanks. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll give a quick overview on HowGood and the data that we have in the system, and then weave it back into what we're doing with Codex and what we see coming forward. So HowGood is the largest sustainability database for food products and ingredients in the world. And we are a software company, venture capital backed, software as a service that works across carbon, nature, and human rights. We also function as a bit of a social network. So it's great if you have access to all the data, but one of the things that's tricky is that sometimes companies don't like to share the data, farmers don't like to share the data, and so we need some incentive structures and some reasons and that organizations, individuals, companies would share and trade data amongst them, and HowGood's platform offers different reasons why that information would be shared around. We've been in business for over 18 years. Maybe we can get to another slide there. 18 years, and you can just click a couple times. 18 years in business, we have a huge number of data sources. We have a huge number of on-farm impact factors, and we've assessed over 4.5 million products at the global level, again, making this the world's largest database. Click once or twice more, and we can go forward. Because of the amount of excellent data that we have, we also have a huge number of companies in the global food system that are already making use of this data to understand that variability, to understand the differences. It starts on the retail side, the far side of it, with companies like Ahold Delhaize, Maf Carrefour in the Middle East, retailers like Amazon, who use the data from our system to understand their upstream impacts, food service companies like Cisco, and then 6 of the 10 largest manufacturers in the world, from Nestle to Danone to Kellogg's, all the way back up to the ingredient suppliers like Ingredion, like Kerry, who are understanding their upstream footprints using our data and then communicating throughout the system using it. So if we go to the next slide, the other thing that's necessary for passing this information around so that different parties can see it is adherence to international standards. So we need unified metrics and unified ways to speak about is this carbon footprint. There's variability not only in the farm production, but you could calculate a product carbon footprint many, many different ways. We have chosen the most widely recognized international standards, and that's ISO 14067. That's the carbon footprint side of their sustainability standards, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's product standard. And we've actually gone and certified our entire platform by a third party to those standards so that you can know as you're passing it from the ingredient supplier to the brand to the retailer that they're getting a comparable apples to apples comparison between those product carbon footprints at each level. That enables reporting to the larger bodies, whether they're regulatory like EU or whether they're voluntary like CDP, GRI, and SBTI. Let's do the next slide. Okay, that's it. Great. So maybe we'll go back one. Let's go back two and talk a little bit about the sort of transfer of information between the different players in the system and then how that connects with Codex Planetarius. So we need vast sums of data so that a brand can think about and choose between different suppliers in their system. And that could mean choosing from different locations. If I'm going to get cacao, should I get it from Ecuador or Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire? If I'm getting palm oil, should I choose from Indonesia or Malaysia or, again, in Ecuador? So HowGood's database holds every single emissions factor for each of those crops in each of those locations as a good starting point. So if more detailed farm-level data is not immediately available, we have a good heuristic starting point drawn from each of those places. But then we can go further. So we can dig into farm-level data and then pull that in, or supplier-specific data, so that companies making decisions between their different suppliers understand what the differential footprint is. We're now also walking towards making that sort of data available at the country level, so that countries can look at where they're exporting to and where they're importing from, and in their procurement decisions and in their trade decisions, start to choose entities with lower footprints overall. Same thing with cities. So our whole idea is that all of this data should be available to anybody who wants to make a decision on carbon so that they can choose what is the lowest carbon approach. If that same sort of data at a global scale across all ingredients, all crops, is visible, that should help make the idea of Codex Planetarius, where you're differentially favoring certain crops that have lower footprints or economically disadvantaging the worst performing crops and ingredients. You need this sort of global visibility of data, and we're very happy to be feeding into it. We're not sure that a fully private sector company can always be the full source of that data, and so where this sort of global data is held that trade decisions are being made off of is a very interesting question. But we have proven that there is technology available to make this fast, relatively inexpensive, and accessible to decision makers around the world.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ethan. And I think that raises a number of interesting points. The first of all, if you have consistent data, and I think that's a big if, because there are so many data sources, so many definitions, it leads to a whole bunch of innovations. So things like creating green futures markets for specific types of green commodity, that only works if you've got very widely accepted global data standards and which are accepted by both traders and by financial exchanges, commodity exchanges like CME. But one of the key outputs for Codex is exactly what Ethan was talking about, is how can you create a consistent platform, global, publicly available, not just at a national but at a sub-national level and across crops, which provides simple consistency along a number of very key indicators. We're never going to get consistency across 192 different indicators, but we're looking at 6 key indicators. Can we all measure soil health in the same way? Can we all measure water stress in the same way? Can we look at emissions in the same way? And one of the things I wanted to ask Emily to start with is how, and we've come across this a lot when we've been looking at Codex and how practical it is, just things like emissions. What is the variability between different types of emissions calculations or within existing tools? I'm just interested on, how much it varies within the same tool for this very similar farms, for example. How, what is the problem here?
Great. Yeah, that is one of the issues that definitely keeps me up at night in a lot of my work. And so, when we're thinking about this variability, so actual variability between some unknown truth of the emissions that are coming from a particular farm and operation, we are then, in many cases, challenged by, well, what's the variability and uncertainty in the measurement that we're taking of this? And we have done a number of assessments of the workhorse of a lot of the carbon calculations for agricultural products, which are farm-level carbon calculators. And what we have found from those is that you will often get 2, and results coming out of DEFRA in the UK have pushed that number all the way up to 9 times different in footprint when looking at the same farm. And that is from calculators that ostensibly are following the same rules, the same standard with respect to the ISO, the IPCC guidance. The small implementation differences of which parameter, which equation was used, which question you ask can produce these really dramatic differences in your final estimation of what the impacts of those farms are. I think really concerningly as well, in some cases, you actually will get a different answer in direction. You try a new practice on that farm, and one tool says, yep, that improves your carbon footprint, and another tool says that it makes it worse. And so we are really grappling with that variability in how we measure it as well. And I don't want to say that this is unique to these types of calculations and estimations. We also know that if you go take a different flux measurement using a different type of tool, one that's operating on a field scale versus a single location over different time frames, you're also going to get different answers. So that is one of the really big challenges that we're facing here, and I think one that also needs to be really carefully tuned to this tail, the worst performers that we're thinking about, because there's obviously a huge range, and we can think about that in terms of practices as well. We're not necessarily worried about whether our calculation or our measurement technique can capture the most innovative new technology that's happening on the best farm. We're worried about whether you can capture the residue burning, the really damaging practices on those worst farms. I do think we're getting a lot more data that is coming out, and also a lot of really exciting efforts in these calculators to try to harmonize and move more in the measurement space to comparing outcomes versus comparing process and saying, well, I followed the IPCC guidance, our numbers should be the same, to saying, we followed IPCC guidance, here is what our result is. Is that consistent with published results? Is that consistent with other calculators? And if not, can we provide guidance and ideally eventually quantitative comparisons to move beyond that? Still very early stages, but I think there is a huge amount of promise there, and something that hopefully engaging with this type of work will really bring some of the brilliant minds towards this problem so that we can make a lot of progress.
Yeah, and I think we are quickly moving towards that unification. We see it at the big scale with ISO and GHG protocol agreeing to harmonize and unify their standards. It'll take a couple years, but then there'll just be one thing instead of 2 different standards to go to. OECD is looking at 250 of these different farm-level calculators and assessing them and essentially scoring them as to some of the differences you're saying, 2 to 9x difference, a lot of these calculators say that they are compliant with one of the things, but very few have been third-party audited and certified to be. That's one of the reasons that we took that extra expense and time and effort, is to make sure we're actually going according to it, and very few of them out there are. And so I think once more knowledge and understanding is visible of like, okay, which ones should we be using if we want to be in line with and doing this sort of global standardized trade data, I think we'll see a honing down from that 250 to a smaller handful of farm level calculators, which should also, to your point, themselves, and they are working towards a quantitative sort of harmony, if not exact melody alignment. They're getting closer and closer, so we should know the differences between them. So I think this will be ironed out in the not so distant future.
And I do just want to add on one more thing with that, which is I think sometimes when we talk about this and we say harmonization, there's this tendency to say, great, so we have one calculator that's the one true calculator that we use for everything. And I don't think that's necessarily what we are saying. There may be folks who are advocating that. There may be cases that you want something really regional, you want something really lightweight that has lower accuracy but super easy for farmers to use. What we need is the ability to contextualize and understand what that result means relative to a calculator that's maybe a little more complicated, but we cannot neglect that user interface component. In my own work, I have seen that if you have a single calculator and you see a branch of a company in one country fills it out and one in the other, you can tell that they answered questions differently because their results are so dramatically different. That user engagement with the tool is also a critical source of potentially error, but also the feasibility to do that. So I do just want to make sure that we're highlighting this is not an advocacy for only one calculator globally for every product.
100% agree, and I'll just add one little bit before you take it again, which is, as I'm thinking about it, it seems like transmitting this information amongst nations or traders in those nations is going to be key, which makes me think we need a global, open, unified standard for the passing back and forth of that information, one that is increasingly technology driven. And so that just brings to mind the work of WBCSD's PACT network, which is basically already setting this up to pass product carbon footprints with all the context. So it's a number and then a number of fields of metadata that describe what year was this for, where was it done, which calculators were used, how much primary data was in there, so that all of the context is there available with the numbers. And this is already working. We've just gained our conformance to that standard, so we'll be passing millions of product carbon footprints around the world in this way. And I think something like that should probably just be adopted by this project so that it's using an open standard that's already well accepted.
Right, and I'd like to come back to that in a second. I think for me, one of the questions here, and it comes back to this sort of variability both within farms but also within tools, and is what we're using this data for is important, and the cost benefit of using this data. And a lot of the work we've been doing has been looking at using this data in a directional way. So can we identify where the hotspots are rather than in incredible detail? I'm not sure I like the expression, but let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. And what we need to understand is where are those 5% of farms or supply sheds which cause 78% of deforestation and then we can audit and then we can contextualize. And so for me, these conversations are incredibly important as part of this overall discussion, and the good thing about programs like Codex is you bring these issues out. But I also think we need to make sure that, if we're looking at risk, and this is all about risk, and if we're looking at efficiency and we're looking at low-cost mechanisms, because high-cost mechanisms don't work, it's important for us to make sure that we get the direction right and then worry about incredible accuracy where we are auditing on the ground. So that was the first thing.
Agreed.
And the second was, to your point, Ethan, maybe you could elaborate a bit. I think one of the things that Codex and for the next stage needs to look at is complete alignment, because nobody needs yet another standard. So there is the key issue for me is alignment with WBCSD, with science-based targets, with IFRS, so the financial side of things, with ISO. What's your view? I mean, I've only mentioned 4 there, but there are a lot more. What's your view on the sort of ecosystem of standards and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the ones that are out there, I think you'll probably need a bit of a mapping of them, but the ones that are out there that are already doing components of this that you need, you should just use them rather than trying to create your own. So any place where there is a standard that is well used, well understood, it took Codex Alimentarius a long time to achieve that, to get to the 180 countries who've signed on to it. It will take some time for Codex also. It would be an interesting question of what the process was that Codex Alimentarius used and what the sort of timeline was to get that to that global level of agreement. I think it's unlikely we'll immediately get 180 countries signing on for Planetarius. That'd be lovely. But it seems more like you'll need bilateral agreements first to test things out, maybe moving to multilateral agreements between countries that are, and also I guess a question I have is, yes, we should use all the standards. That's my answer to your question. PACT is a really good one because it's globally, it's used, it's food industry, but it's also beyond the food industry. It's simple. You can go look at everything up on GitHub. It's in version 3 now. There's an API network that does connectivity. So once you test conformance, it's literally instantaneous to send this data wherever it needs to go. It protects sensitive IP of the companies who are using it, so it's not all the information about a certain commodity. It's just the footprint and then a bunch of metadata and explanation around it. So that's a really good one to use. I think a question I have is a little more like, what is the structure or mechanism? What does it look like in a trade agreement between two countries or multiple countries that would do that sort of, you had that image of a regulatory push. This is maybe regulatory, it's not quite regulatory, it's sort of commercial trade regulatory. How do you actually economically disadvantage the worst producers? Like, what is the actual mechanism of doing that?
Right, and yeah, good question. And where we are is a set of options, both at a policy level and a threshold level. So two different things about how you impact trade. And there's a bunch of different ways you could do it, but I suppose where directionally we're heading, and this is all currently under development, so this isn't definitive, is very much looking at risk-based assessment. So everyone can trade. You get audited if there is a significant risk at a particular aggregation point or a particular geography. So it's very light touch that everyone trades unless there is a significant risk flagged, at which point there is an audit, which is statistically, again, you're trying for a light touch, low cost.
And this is risk of a higher footprint, risk of that worst, that bottom
Right.
10 to 20%. Okay.
Correct. So you're looking at the tail. This is all about the tail. And aligned with that is you're then looking at thresholds. So it's all relative. You're saying, okay, and again, how you set these is an open question, but the easiest way of doing this is saying, okay, let's try and take away 1% of emissions, which will affect very, very few farms if you're looking at, if you're within a country. So this is within a country, within a crop, 1% of emissions, 1% of water use. And that is what you look at from a risk point of view, and that is what you target when you do audit. And if the farms if the farms fail that audit, then what you do is you help them mitigate that. And that is where money comes in, because none of this works if you're simply saying, look, we're targeting smaller or marginal producers, and all we're going to do is actually say you're not going to export, because part of the issue here is not all of them will be connected to export markets. Some of these will be purely domestic producers. And the second is, unless you've got money to either help them improve or get out of farming if they can't improve, this isn't going to work.
So you audit, you find a set of soy producers or whatever that have that on that higher end of the footprint. Then what? Do they still get to sell their stuff, or does it get stopped? They don't actually get to trade it, or is there extra levy put on it? Or
no, it's the idea is they don't get to sell into the export market. They can sell into the domestic market, and that becomes that's the stick. But you also need a carrot, which is you can't simply say, okay, we're going to disadvantage you by stopping you. You need mitigation. You need adaptation. You need money to either improve or stop.
Okay, so you might not get as high price by exporting. You're going to get a lower price selling on the domestic market, but actually there's money coming into you that may make up that little gap to help you make some changes so you can try again and export next season.
Correct. Exactly. That's broadly the concept.
Cool. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Has this ever been done anywhere?
No. But that's what we're here for. We're here to look at innovations and the whole point of this is, and the whole point of that theory, again, that's just one of the models we're looking at, is it's a very light touch, risk-based, low-cost way of looking at, because we're not talking about just conversion or deforestation here, we're talking about water use, soil health, all these biodiversity, all these sort of aspects which make up productivity growth.
Okay, have you looked at another route to it, which is like in the export market for a country, the country facilitates the gathering of the carbon footprint for every farm or every supplier that's getting stuff ready to send for export. So you actually have the full footprint of everything, and then either there's a gradated or there's a threshold, and there's just like an extra tax or levy that's like, if you're in the lowest 20%, sure, you can still sell, but we're going to drop an extra tax on that because it's the worst performing.
But I think that disincentivize them to improve. For me, the whole point of this is that you are using trade as a stick, and that there needs to be an incentive to improve rather than a tax on those. So they probably can't afford it anyway. These tend to be smaller marginal farms. So and I suppose part of this is, and our next stage is looking at running these sort of numbers and running these different models with governments. So that's what we'll be doing from February next year. In the next stage of this is doing this with a number of governments, and they will be doing the numbers themselves. This isn't something this is not a WWF project, this is much wider. So we're incubating this, we are managing this, and how it works in practice is going to be very dependent on how that works and how it works within existing legislation. Emily, anything to add?
Yeah, I think really just wanted to add, I think, to your point that when we are thinking about what is the kind of existing infrastructure and role of some of these producing countries, just want to highlight that there are some really great examples already out there of where we're seeing that pre-existing effort to characterize how farms are doing. So, I think we can think about Ireland's Board Bia, some of the work they do, and, boots on the ground farm footprints for their cattle and dairy sector. We can also, think about there's a lot of really great work from different cooperatives in many regions who are doing this kind of bottom-up effort to collect data for their own sector. I believe the pork industry in Spain has been doing a lot of work originally on nutrient management, but have been extending this to greenhouse gas emissions, and also nod to our friends at the OECD who have been collating a lot of those efforts to understand how we can be linking some of those more national level infrastructures and data collection to move towards something like this. So I do think there are a lot of pieces and really strong foundations that we can both build on and learn from.
Chris, can you I'm just curious a little bit more about the mechanical structure of the 1% fund. And
absolutely. So, but before you do that, I think one of the things, just following from Emily's point, is that this is not a tropical commodity. Codex is not for tropical commodities. This isn't like a sort of EUDR, which is particularly around deforestation and conversion. This is, because we're looking at a whole range, this is as applicable to Australian wheat, which is water scarce, as it is to Brazilian soy. So I think I just wanted to make that clear. This is global in nature. It's not targeting a specific environmental impact or a specific type of commodity. It's broad and it's cross-commodity. And I think the other thing is that absent, and it's quite been interesting looking at these pilot studies around 8 countries and 8 global commodities, is absent a global standard, it's being done already. State governments in Brazil, the state of Espírito Santo is a good example, is already doing this with a minimum environmental curriculum, which is legislated. The same is true for cocoa in Ghana. You've got the ARS, which is starting to impose. In Indonesia, you've got the Indonesian palm oil standard, same in Malaysia. So absent consistent, and we could argue for a long time about the positives and negatives of that, but absent regulatory global action on this, it's being done either by private sector or by governments anyway. So, and again, at a very minimum level, as a broad raising the bar strategy, it makes sense as a way of creating consistency. Sorry, and to your 1% point, the mechanism is really, so the original idea was a 1% levy at FOB. So at port of export, you collect on the basis of FOB. So it's an export levy. I mean, this happens in a bunch of raw material and natural resource commodities, oil, metals. It's pretty common in those. It's quite often done by certain countries already. For ag commodities, Argentina is a good example. The mechanism, though, is we're really looking at it rather than sort of taking a 1% levy. And a 1% levy, maybe it's 0.5%, maybe it's 2%. The whole point is setting a level that's not material from an end price point of view. A 1% levy on soy equates to about a 0.1% wholesale price increase in pork in China, for example, give or take. So the idea is to make it non-material to price elasticity and setting it at a level that does that, and then using it, rather than using it, putting it in a big fund which then pays out, is to create a much more sophisticated risk pool, again, based on other raw materials like oil, which then pays out to create systemic problems and creates compliance and ensures that some of the legality issues and supply chain issues are fixed at a very fundamental level.
Did you say there was something like this happening with metals? Was it?
Not on a funding point of view. There is, so in metals, there's a really interesting, the London Metals Exchange has a really interesting program, which is the LME Passport, which embeds environmental and social indicators into COAs, which is a really interesting way of getting this sort of codex type information through the supply chain.
Right, maybe before there's levies and audits and you can't sell this, and maybe even just getting the information in there alongside the commodities as they move would be an interesting step that countries would be willing to do before
100%.
the...
Yeah. Completely agree. And I think if there's nothing else, I think we can probably close. Do you have anything else to say, Emily?
I think just echoing your last point about how we are thinking through this, really just to return to what you said earlier about all of this work being anchored in productivity and the real risks that this presents. Just want to emphasize, and I think there are going to be so many other sessions that we're hearing both at this COP and with research that's coming out, just emphasizing that when we are talking about these worst producers, in many cases, there are risks to the global, to the global climate from these emissions, but also in many of these cases, especially water, but things like deforestation with local microclimates, where we're seeing on these edge of deforestation 3 degrees Celsius increases in ambient temperature that are impacting yields right now, not in the 1.5 to 3 degree future, right now, that those risks are really, really salient and being felt, and that when we are talking about that local context for those risks, I just feel like I couldn't let us close without returning to that point that I think is so, so critical when we think about, yes, there's a lot of challenges to this, but that's why we have to do this, is to make sure that we are still able to produce that food going forward.
Thank you. Ethan, anything else before we close?
I think one thing that all of this is pointing to is a major shift in how carbon tracking and accounting and reporting has happened in the world for the last 10 to 20 years. We have had a sort of top-down approach of accounting where it's like you calculate your scope 1 and 2, and everybody did that because that was pretty easy. You just look at the electric bill. Then it was like, scope 3 is hard. We don't know if we can do this, but over time we've gotten better and better. Now with platforms like ours and others that are out there, it's really fast and easy to get a very good idea of your scope 3 footprint. But then there's still this approach that's like, we'll take from that top down, and then in order to pass information through our supply system, we allocate a certain portion of our footprint to our downstream customer. And it's just too blunt to really understand the detail of what's happening, the variability you're talking about. And so we are advocating for and seeing a shift starting to happen to a bottom-up accounting, where you're really looking at the individual footprint of individual commodities, individual places, suppliers, farms, and then bringing that, using things like Pact and using software, bringing that up through the system so you can actually track and see where the impacts are, and you can target where should I work in my supply system in order to reduce the impact, in order to collaborate with my suppliers to do that mitigation you're talking about. If you don't have a bottom-up accounting, you can't really see where that is. It's too blunt and too opaque in the system. So I think that Codex Planetarius is another aspect of advocating for, we need to be able to see that level of detail. Not perfection. I totally agree, we don't need perfection, but if we can jump to a more granular start from the beginning and normalize that, we will actually just get more efficient and effective at driving reductions and driving improvements in our supply systems when we do that bottom-up approach.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for listening. Fantastic.
Thanks, y'all.